The summer of 1871 brought unprecedented violence to the Texas frontier, where flames consumed dreams as readily as they devoured timber. In these unforgiven borderlands, where survival demanded both luck and resilience, a single act of mercy between sworn enemies would forever alter the fate of two people from vastly different worlds. This is the extraordinary tale of Eleanor Montgomery, a young schoolteacher who lost everything in a single night of terror, and the choice made by a Comanche warrior named Two Hawks when he found her amidst the burning ruins of Willow Creek. Choice that would eventually bring 30 Comanche riders to her doorstep under a full moon, bearing gifts that would change not just her life, but an entire community's understanding of what peace might truly mean. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. July heat pressed down on the Texas plains like a blacksmith's anvil, unrelenting and merciless. Eleanor Montgomery stood on the small porch of Willow Creek Schoolhouse, watching her students scatter toward home after the final lesson of the day. At 26, she had already spent 4 years teaching in this modest frontier settlement, having arrived with little more than determination and a trunk full of books. The town of Willow Creek had grown steadily since its founding in 1865, attracting families eager to claim land and build futures away from the devastation left by the Civil War. Currently home to roughly 200 souls, the settlement featured a general store, a small church, the schoolhouse where Eleanor taught, and about 30 homesteads scattered across the surrounding countryside. As the last child disappeared around the bend in the dirt road, Eleanor retreated into the relative coolness of the schoolhouse. She lived in 2 small rooms attached to the back of the building, modest accommodations that the town provided as part of her teaching position. The arrangement suited her perfectly. After losing her parents to typhoid in Philadelphia and her fiancé to the war, Eleanor had sought purpose and independence far from the painful memories of her former life. She gathered the spelling primers and arranged them neatly on the shelf, her mind already planning tomorrow's lessons. Though the heat made concentration difficult, Eleanor found comfort in the familiar routines of her profession. Teaching brought her genuine joy and a sense of contribution to this growing community. Sheriff Nathan Miller's arrival interrupted her thoughts. His horse's hooves kicked up dust outside as he dismounted and climbed the schoolhouse steps with unusual haste. "Miss Montgomery," he called, removing his hat as he entered. "Glad I caught you before you retired for the evening." Eleanor noted the tension in his weathered face immediately. At 45, Miller had served as lawman in 3 different frontier settlements and carried himself with the cautious authority of someone who had seen too much violence. "Sheriff Miller, is something amiss?" she asked, setting aside the chalk she'd been organizing. "Afraid so. Got word from Fort Richardson that a band of Comanche has been spotted about 30 miles northwest of here. They attacked the Peterson homestead yesterday. Not survivors." Eleanor's hand went to her throat, a chill passing through her despite the heat. The Peterson family had attended the spring social just 2 months earlier. Their youngest daughter, Mary, was to start school in the fall. "That's terrible news," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Armies dispatched a patrol, but they're spread thin. I'm organizing a meeting at the church tonight to discuss precautions." Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Truth is, Miss Montgomery, I'm concerned about you living out here on the edge of town, alone in the schoolhouse." "I've been perfectly safe these past 4 years," Eleanor replied, though the news had clearly shaken her. "These aren't ordinary times. The treaties aren't worth the paper they're written on, and the reservation system's creating more problems." "Then it's solving. Hungry people get desperate, and desperate people get dangerous, no matter what color their skin." He looked around the schoolhouse with a critical eye. This building wouldn't withstand much of an attack. Eleanor appreciated his candor, even as his words filled her with dread. She had read about the conflicts between settlers and the native, tribes, understood the tragic complexities from both perspectives, but had always felt somewhat removed from the violence that occasionally flared across the frontier. "What would you suggest?" she asked pragmatically. "The Reynolds family has offered to take you in until things settle. They've got that sturdy stone house, and with John's brothers staying there, extra protection too." Eleanor considered the offer. The Reynolds were kind people, and their 15-year-old daughter was one of her brightest students. But the thought of abandoning her independence, even temporarily, felt like surrendering something precious. "Let me attend the meeting tonight, before making any decisions," she said finally. "Perhaps the situation isn't quite as dire as initial reports suggest." Sheriff Miller nodded, though his expression indicated he thought otherwise. "Meeting's at 7. Don't be late, and maybe pack a few essentials just in case." After he departed, Eleanor moved slowly through her small living quarters, trying to imagine what essentials one packed when facing potential danger. Her gaze fell on her father's old revolver, kept in the top drawer of her dresser. She had brought it west as a precaution, but had never fired it outside of the single afternoon when Jacob Reynolds had offered to teach her its proper use. The town meeting that evening did little to alleviate concerns. Nearly everyone from Willow Creek crowded into the church, faces solemn as Sheriff Miller and Mayor Hammond outlined the situation. The territorial governor had requested additional military presence along the frontier, but reinforcements wouldn't arrive for at least 2 weeks. Until then, communities needed to implement their own protective measures. "We'll establish a rotation of armed men patrolling the town perimeter," Mayor Hammond explained. "Everyone should consider consolidating, families with sturdy homes taking in those with more vulnerable dwellings." Eleanor sat quietly in the back row, noting the fear that rippled through the assembly. Some faces reflected grim determination, others barely concealed panic. The Miller twins, barely 18, spoke loudly about hunting Indians, until their father silenced them with a stern look. Mrs. Abernathy clutched her infant son to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. After the meeting, several families approached Eleanor with offers of shelter, but she politely declined each one. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or simply the need to maintain some control in an increasingly uncertain situation. But Eleanor couldn't bring herself to abandon the schoolhouse. It represented everything she had built in her new life. "I'll reinforce the doors and windows," she assured a concerned Mrs. Reynolds, and Sheriff Miller promised to include the school in the regular patrols. That night, Eleanor slept fitfully, the revolver placed on the nightstand within reach. She dreamed of burning. Homesteads and children's primers turned to ash, waking several times to listen for sounds beyond her windows. The night passed without incident, however, and morning brought a deceptive normalcy to Willow Creek. For 3 days, the community existed in a state of heightened vigilance. Men patrolled with rifles, children were kept close to home, and the usually bustling main street remained eerily quiet during daylight hours. Eleanor continued teaching, though only half her students attended. Many families had already sent women and children to stay with relatives in larger settlements. On the 4th night, disaster struck with terrifying swiftness. Eleanor woke to the sound of gunshots and shouting shortly after midnight. Through her window, she saw an orange glow illuminating the night sky from the direction of the town center. Dressing hastily and grabbing her revolver, she moved to her front door, only to freeze at the sound of hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Peering cautiously through a crack in the curtains, Eleanor saw riders moving along the main road. Not the uniformed cavalry she desperately hoped for, but shadowy figures on paint ponies. Their whoops and cries confirmed her worst fears. Willow Creek was under attack. Heart pounding, Eleanor retreated to her small bedroom, mind racing through limited options. The schoolhouse, with its wooden construction and multiple windows, offered little protection. She could attempt to flee through the back door and make for the creek bed, hoping to hide among the willows until danger passed. Or she could remain hidden, praying the attackers would focus on the stores and livestock rather than an empty schoolhouse. Before she could decide, a crash from the main classroom shattered her deliberations. Someone had broken through the front door. Eleanor gripped the revolver with trembling hands, backing into the corner of her bedroom as footsteps moved through the schoolhouse. "Hello? Is anyone here?" A woman's voice called out, Martha Reynolds, the mother of her student. "Eleanor? We need to go, now." Relief flooded through Eleanor as she rushed to meet her neighbor. Martha stood in the doorway, her husband's shotgun clutched in her hands, face streaked with soot. "The general store is burning," Martha explained breathlessly. "They hit there first, then the mayor's house. John and the others are trying to organize a defense, but there are at least 20 riders. We're evacuating everyone to our place. The stone walls will hold better than most." Together, they slipped out the back door of the schoolhouse, only to find that the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The orange glow had intensified, now clearly visible, as flames consuming several buildings along the main street. Screams and gunfire created a terrifying cacophony in the previously peaceful night. "Stay low and follow me," Martha instructed, leading the way toward the creek that gave the town its name. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when hoofbeats approached from behind. Eleanor turned to see 3 riders emerging from the darkness, closing rapidly on their position. Martha raised the shotgun, but never got a chance to fire. A shot rang out, and Martha crumpled to the ground with a soft cry. "Martha!" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside her friend, but even in the dim light could see that the wound was fatal. Martha's eyes fixed on something beyond Eleanor, widening in terror. Eleanor raised her father's revolver, turning to face the approaching riders, knowing it was futile, but unwilling to die without resistance. As the lead rider came into view, moonlight revealed features that would forever be seared into her memory. A young Comanche warrior, his face painted for war, mounted on a magnificent pinto stallion. Their eyes met across the small distance, and in that moment something inexplicable passed between them. The warrior raised his hand, not to strike, but in a gesture that seemed almost like recognition. Then, shouting something to his companions, he wheeled his horse and rode toward the burning buildings of Willow Creek, leaving Eleanor kneeling beside her fallen friend, alone in the darkness as her world collapsed into flames around her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn revealed the full extent of Willow Creek's devastation. Nearly half the buildings along the main street had been reduced to smoldering ruins. The general store, the church, and 5 homesteads were now little more than charred timber and ash. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air like a shroud, mixing with other scents Eleanor's mind refused to identify. She had spent the remaining hours of darkness hidden among the dense willows that lined the creek bed, trembling from shock and fear. Martha Reynolds' body lay where she had fallen. Eleanor had been unable to move her friend's lifeless form or even close her staring eyes before the sound of returning riders forced her deeper into hiding. Now, as pale sunlight illuminated the destruction, Eleanor emerged cautiously from her concealment. The attack appeared to be over. The Comanche raiders had disappeared as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving devastation in their wake. Distant voices caught her attention, survivors calling out to one another across the ruined settlement. Eleanor made her way toward the sounds, stepping carefully through the wreckage. Her schoolhouse had not escaped the violence, though still, standing, its windows were shattered and the door hung askew on broken hinges. Inside, desks had been overturned and books torn apart, pages scattered across the floor like wounded birds. "Miss Montgomery." The voice belonged to Samuel Cooper, The blacksmith, his normally immaculate apron now soot-stained and torn. "Thank the Lord, we feared you were among the taken." "Taken," Eleanor repeated, the word foreign to her shock-numbed mind. "They took 7 people, mostly women and children," Samuel explained grimly, "including the Abernathy baby and the miller. Twins. Sheriff's organizing a rescue party now." Eleanor struggled to process this additional horror. Captives were rarely recovered, according to the grim frontier stories she'd heard, but preferred not to believe. "How many?" She couldn't finish the question. 11 dead that we've found. Mayor Hammond among them." Samuel's voice cracked. "My. Jenny's helping tend the wounded at the Reynolds place. They're gathering everyone there." Eleanor nodded mechanically. "Martha Reynolds is dead. By the creek. I couldn't—" Her voice failed as tears finally came, hot and sudden. Samuel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Not your fault, miss. Nothing anyone could have done against those devils." Together they made their way toward the Reynolds homestead, one of the few structures built of stone rather than wood, and consequently one of the few left standing. Along the way, they passed other survivors sorting through the remains of their lives. Mr. Peterson from the Mercantile sat on his front steps, staring at the ruined shell of his business with vacant eyes. The Williams children huddled together. Beside a water trough, their parents nowhere to be seen. The Reynolds home had been transformed into an improvised infirmary. The front room contained 6 makeshift pallets, each occupied by a wounded townsperson. Jenny Cooper moved between them, applying bandages and offering water. In the corner, Reverend Lawson recited prayers over a covered form, another soul lost despite surviving the initial attack. John Reynolds met them at the door, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. When Eleanor told him about his wife, the strong rancher seemed to physically diminish, shoulders slumping as if under an unbearable weight. "I sent her to find you," he whispered. "She insisted. She saved my life," Eleanor told him, the inadequacy of the words burning in her throat. "She was very brave." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor assisted Jenny with the wounded, tearing her petticoat into strips for bandages and helping administer the dwindling supply of laudanum to those in greatest pain. Sheriff Miller organized the remaining able-bodied men into a pursuit party, though most understood the grim reality. Tracking Comanche raiders across the open plains was nearly impossible, and the chances of recovering captives diminished with each passing hour. By late afternoon, a new problem had become apparent. The attack had destroyed most of Willow Creek's food supplies. The general store and its storeroom were completely gone. Several family root cellars had been looted during the raid. The community faced not only the immediate crisis of wounded and dead, but the looming threat of starvation. "Fort Richardson will send supplies when they hear what's happened," Sheriff Miller assured the gathered survivors. "We just need to hold out until then." "And how do we do that, Nathan?" demanded Frederick Williams, his voice sharp with grief and anger. "My children haven't eaten since yesterday. The Comanche took everything we had." Eleanor listened to the growing argument from the doorway of the Reynolds home, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She had not slept or eaten in nearly 24 hours, and the combined trauma of the attack and its aftermath left her feeling hollow, disconnected from the heated debate around her. Her gaze drifted toward the schoolhouse visible in the distance. Though damaged, it remained standing. Perhaps some of her personal supplies had survived the destruction. The thought of returning there filled her with dread, but practicality overrode emotion. If she had food or anything else useful, the community needed it now. "I'm going to check the schoolhouse," she told Jenny Cooper quietly. "There might be something salvageable." "You shouldn't go alone," Jenny protested, but her hands were occupied changing a bandage on young Peter Baldwin's burned arm. "I'll be fine. The raiders are long gone and it's only a short walk." The journey back to the schoolhouse felt longer than it should have. Every shadow seemed menacing, every rustle of wind through the remaining buildings a potential threat. Eleanor moved cautiously, her father's revolver now a constant companion at her waist. The bodies had been gathered for burial, but dark stains on the ground marked where neighbors and friends had fallen. The schoolhouse looked even worse upon closer inspection. Besides the broken windows and door, part of the roof had been damaged by fire, though the flames had apparently died before consuming the entire structure. Inside, the destruction was comprehensive. Books torn apart, desks splintered, the small blackboard shattered. Eleanor picked her way through the debris to her living quarters at the back. Here, too, chaos reigned. Her clothes had been pulled from the dresser and scattered, her small collection of personal treasures smashed or stolen. The mattress had been slashed, feathers spilling onto the floor like snow. Fighting despair, Eleanor searched for anything useful. Her food storage, a small cabinet containing flour, sugar, coffee, and preserved goods, had been emptied, the contents either taken or destroyed. She managed to salvage a half-empty sack of cornmeal that had fallen behind the stove and remained undiscovered, along with 3 jars of preserves from under her bed. As she gathered these meager findings, movement at the window caught her attention. Eleanor froze, her hand moving to the revolver. A shadow passed across the broken glass. Too tall for a child, too purposeful for casual investigation. Heart pounding, she pressed herself against the wall beside the window, straining to listen. Soft footsteps circled the building, stopping at the damaged doorway. Eleanor raised the revolver, finger trembling against the trigger as a figure appeared. In the doorframe, the man who stood there was not a townsperson. Tall and powerfully built, he wore buckskin leggings and a cloth shirt, his long black hair tied with a leather thong. Most startling were his eyes, dark and intelligent, studying her with an intensity that seemed to look straight through her defensive posture. Eleanor recognized him immediately, the Comanche warrior who had locked eyes with her during the raid. The one who had raised his hand and then ridden away instead of attacking. "You," she whispered, the revolver wavering in her grip. The warrior remained motionless, hands visible at his sides in what seemed a deliberate gesture. After a long moment he spoke, his English accented but clear. "You are alone. Dangerous." Eleanor's mind raced through limited options. Shooting might bring help from town, or might bring other raiders if this man wasn't alone. Running was impossible, with him blocking the only exit. "My people are nearby," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "They'll be here any moment." Something like amusement flickered in the warrior's eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "No people come, all at Stonehouse." He gestured toward the Reynolds homestead. "You alone." "What do you want?" Eleanor demanded, tightening her grip on the revolver. "You've already taken everything." The warrior shook his head slowly. "Not me, not my band, different Comanche." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I am 2 Hawks of the Pennateca band, tracking those who attacked." Eleanor's confusion must have shown on her face because he continued, his words measured as, if carefully chosen, not all Comanche same. Some bands make peace with whites, some fight, some raid for food only, some, he hesitated, some kill for revenge or glory. "And which are you?" Eleanor challenged, though she hadn't lowered the gun. 2 Hawks studied her for a long moment before answering. "I am scout for peace chiefs. Watch borders. Report to Fort Sill what happens." His gaze traveled over the destruction visible through the broken window. "This raid not authorized by council. Breaking treaties. Bringing trouble to all Comanche." Eleanor struggled to reconcile this articulate explanation with everything she'd been told about the savage Comanche. The revolver felt suddenly heavier. In her hand, its simple solution inadequate for the complexity of the man standing before her. "Why are you here, in my schoolhouse?" she asked finally. 2 Hawks gestured to the meager supplies she had gathered. "You find food? Good, but not enough." He reached slowly into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. "Take this. Pemmican. Strong food for traveling." He placed the package on an overturned desk, then stepped back toward the door. "Not safe here alone. Kiowa scouts report army coming from fort. Many soldiers, angry soldiers. Not good time for any Indian near white settlement." His eyes held hers once more. Not good time for white woman alone either. Before Eleanor could respond, he had slipped away, his movements so fluid and silent she might have imagined the entire exchange, except for the small package of pemmican resting on the desk, tangible proof that a Comanche warrior had offered help instead of harm. Eleanor stared at the doorway long after two hawks had disappeared, the revolver finally lowered to her side, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Everything she thought she understood about the frontier's brutal conflicts had been complicated by this brief, unexpected encounter. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruined town of Willow Creek. Eleanor gathered the cornmeal, preserves, and, after a moment's hesitation, the pemmican, and began the walk back to the Reynolds homestead, wondering how to explain that the food she brought included a gift from the very people they had been taught to fear. The cavalry arrived from Fort Richardson at dawn, 2 days after the attack. Captain James Thornton led 35 soldiers into what remained of Willow Creek, their blue uniforms and gleaming equipment a stark contrast to the ash-covered devastation. The survivors gathered in the town's center to meet them, hope and desperation evident on their haggard faces. Eleanor stood slightly apart from the group, observing the military precision with which the soldiers established their presence. The events of the past 48 hours had left her feeling disconnected from her neighbors, though she had worked alongside them to tend the wounded and distribute the meager food supplies. She had not mentioned her encounter with two hawks. The pemmican, a dense mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, had been added to the community's shared resources, with a vague explanation about finding it in her storage cabinet. The lie troubled her, but Eleanor couldn't imagine how to explain receiving food from a Comanche without facing suspicion or worse. Captain Thornton dismounted with practiced efficiency, handing his reins to a young private before approaching. "Sheriff Miller." "Sheriff," he greeted, his voice carrying the clipped authority of West Point training. "We came as soon as your messenger reached the fort. Lieutenant Collins, see to distributing emergency rations." A flurry of activity followed, as soldiers unloaded supplies from pack horses. Blankets, medical supplies, and food were quickly organized for distribution. Eleanor found herself assisting the fort's young surgeon, Dr. Elliot Pierce, as he examined the remaining wounded. "You've done remarkably well with limited resources," Dr. Pierce commented, as he checked Peter Baldwin's burned arm. "These bandages are expertly applied. My father was a doctor in Philadelphia," Eleanor explained, handing him fresh bandages from the military supplies. "I assisted him occasionally before coming west." "A fortunate coincidence for these people," the doctor remarked. "This boy might have lost his arm without proper care." As they worked, Eleanor overheard Captain Thornton's conversation with the town's leaders. His words painted a grim picture of the broader situation. "The Kiowa Comanche uprising is spreading across the Western Territories," Thornton explained. "Fort Sill reports at least 3 bands have left the reservation. The peace policy is collapsing." "What about our captives?" John Reynolds demanded. 7 of our people were taken." Captain Thornton's expression tightened. "We'll pursue, of course, but I must be candid. The trail is already cold, and my orders prioritize protecting surviving settlements over rescue operations." A murmur of distress moved through the gathered survivors. Frederick Williams stepped forward, his 2 remaining children clinging to his legs. "My wife is among those taken, Captain," he said, voice raw with emotion. "You can't just abandon them." "I understand your distress, sir," Thornton replied, not unkindly. "I've dispatched scouts to try locating the raiding party. If we can identify their direction of travel, we'll send word to other military units." In the territory, Eleanor watched the hope drain from Frederick's face. The frontier's harsh realities offered little comfort to those separated from loved ones by violence. The Williams children, Sarah, age 8, and Joshua, barely 5, seemed to sense their father's despair, pressing closer to him in silent support. By midday, the immediate crisis had eased somewhat. Military supplies ensured no one would starve in the coming days, and the wounded had received proper medical attention. Captain Thornton ordered his men to assist with clearing debris and constructing temporary shelters for those whose homes had been destroyed. Eleanor found herself alone in the damaged schoolhouse, salvaging what she could from the wreckage. Most of the books were beyond repair, their pages scattered or burned, but she discovered her small collection of Shakespeare had somehow survived, wedged beneath an overturned shelf. "You must be the school teacher," a voice observed from the doorway. Eleanor turned to find Captain Thornton watching her, his uniform now bearing smudges of the same ash that covered everything in Willow Creek. "Eleanor Montgomery," she confirmed, rising and brushing dust from her skirt. "Thank you for bringing supplies. Your men have been very helpful." Thornton nodded, stepping further into the schoolhouse to survey the damage. "Brutal business," he commented. "Though unfortunately not uncommon. This is the third settlement, hit in the past month." "The third?" Eleanor echoed, thinking of Two Hawks's words about unauthorized raids. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," Thornton confirmed. "The peace factions among the tribes are losing influence to younger warriors who see violence as the only response to reservation conditions." He paused, studying her face. "You seem troubled beyond the obvious reasons, Miss Montgomery." Eleanor hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "I've lived on this frontier for 4 years, Captain. I've taught children whose parents fought in the Indian Wars, and I've heard every story about Comanche brutality, but I've also read government reports describing conditions on the reservations. Reports rarely capture the full complexity of the situation," Thornton interrupted, though not unkindly. "Both sides have legitimate grievances and valid fears. Unfortunately, those least responsible for creating the problems often suffer the worst consequences." He gestured toward the window, where the Williams children could be seen helping soldiers clear debris. "Those children have lost their mother and their home. Meanwhile, Comanche children on the reservation are dying of measles and malnutrition. There are no simple villains or heroes in this conflict, Miss Montgomery." His unexpected nuance surprised Eleanor. "You speak as if you understand the native perspective, Captain." A shadow passed across Thornton's face. "I've spent 10 years on this frontier, fought against Comanche, negotiated with them, occasionally admired them. Any soldier who doesn't try to understand his opponent is a fool destined for an early grave." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts from the edge of town drew their attention. Through the broken window, Eleanor saw soldiers running toward the eastern perimeter, rifles ready. "Stay here," Thornton ordered, already moving toward the door, his hand on his sidearm. Eleanor followed despite his command, emerging onto the schoolhouse steps as a soldier on horseback galloped into town, his uniform torn and bloodied. "Captain!" he called, reining in his lathered horse. "Comanche, sir, just over the ridge to the east. But they're not raiders. They've got white captives with them." The news electrified the gathered townspeople. Frederick Williams pushed forward. "My Abigail?" "Don't know, sir," the soldier replied. "Saw at least 3 white women with them. They sent me ahead with a message. Their leader wants to parley." Captain Thornton's expression hardened. "How many?" 6 warriors, sir, carrying a white flag." Thornton turned to his lieutenant. "Prepare a delegation. 10 men, fully armed but weapons lowered. We'll meet them at the eastern ridge." He addressed the hopeful townspeople. This could be a trap. Everyone else stays in town under guard. Eleanor watched the military contingent ride out, her mind racing. 6 Comanche warriors returning captives and requesting parley fit nothing in the frontier narratives she had heard. Combined with her encounter with 2 hawks, it suggested layers of complexity to the frontier conflicts that few acknowledged. Unable to contain her curiosity, Eleanor slipped away from the gathered survivors and made her way to the broken church steeple, the highest remaining vantage point in Willow Creek. Climbing carefully over debris, she reached a position where she could observe the eastern ridge. Without being easily spotted, through a gap in the damaged roof, Eleanor had a clear view of the meeting point. Captain Thornton's men had formed a precise line, facing 6 mounted Comanche warriors. Between them stood 3 white women, their clothing torn and dirty but appearing otherwise unharmed. Distance prevented Eleanor from hearing the exchange, but she could see Captain Thornton conversing with the lead Comanche, whose distinctive headdress marked him as a person of importance. After several minutes, the women were escorted to the soldiers, and one of Thornton's men removed his coat to place around the shoulders of the youngest captive. Most surprising was what happened next. Instead of retreating or attacking, the Comanche leader dismounted, as did Captain Thornton. The 2 men stood face to face on neutral ground, engaged in what appeared to be serious discussion. Their respective forces maintained positions, weapons visible but not aimed. Eleanor watched, transfixed, as this unprecedented diplomatic exchange unfolded against the backdrop of a frontier supposedly defined by mutual hatred and incomprehension. After what seemed an eternity, both leaders remounted their horses. The Comanche party turned and rode eastward, while Thornton led his men and the rescued women back toward Willow Creek. The town erupted in celebration as the returning party entered the settlement. 2 of the rescued women were immediately surrounded by joyful family members, including Sarah and Joshua Williams, who clung to their mother with desperate relief. The 3rd woman, whom Eleanor didn't recognize, was assisted to the doctor's wagon, her vacant expression suggesting trauma beyond physical injury. Eleanor approached as Captain Thornton dismounted, his face reflecting complex emotions beneath his professional composure. 3 returned, she observed quietly. What about the others? Thornton removed his hat, running a hand through sweat-dampened hair. According to Chief Grey Wolf, the other captives were taken by a different band, the same one that attacked Willow Creek. His people intercepted this group while tracking the raiders. They rescued them? Eleanor asked, struggling to reconcile this with everything she had been told about intertribal cooperation. Apparently, Thornton replied, his voice low enough that only Eleanor could hear. There's significant division among the Comanche bands. Grey Wolf leads a peace faction that maintained friendly relations with certain military officers at Fort Sill. He claims the raiders violated council decisions and tribal law by attacking settlements without provocation. Eleanor thought of 2 hawks and his explanation about unauthorized raids. You believe him? Thornton's gaze met hers, measuring her reaction. I've known Grey Wolf for 3 years, Miss Montgomery. He's never broken his word to me, which is more than I can say for some government officials I've served under. Before Eleanor could respond, Lieutenant Collins approached. Sir, preparations to return to the fort? Change of plans, Lieutenant, Thornton replied. We'll establish a temporary garrison here. Grey Wolf reports the renegade band is planning additional attacks on settlements in this region. Willow Creek will serve as our forward operating position. The news spread quickly. Through the community, cavalry protection would remain, at least temporarily. For many survivors, this represented the first genuine hope since the attack. For Eleanor, it created an unexpected complication. As she helped distribute food to the resettled families that evening, Eleanor found herself pondering the implications of Two Hawk's appearance, Grey Wolf's intervention, and Captain Thornton's surprising perspective. The frontier narrative of civilization versus savagery was dissolving before her eyes, replaced by something far more complex and morally ambiguous. When she finally returned to the damaged schoolhouse that night, eschewing offers of safer accommodations, at the Reynolds home, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. Outside, military sentries patrolled the perimeter of Willow Creek, their footsteps a rhythmic reminder of protection, but also of ongoing danger. Near midnight, a soft sound at her broken window brought Eleanor instantly alert. A shadow moved across the moonlit floor, not a soldier's uniform, but the distinctive silhouette of a figure she recognized, despite having met him only once. Two hawks had returned. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor kept her voice low, acutely, aware of the soldiers patrolling nearby. "The cavalry has established a garrison." Two hawks moved silently into the room, his form barely visible in the moonlight, filtering through the broken window. "Soldiers make poor sentries. Too much noise, too little patience." Despite the danger his presence represented, Eleanor felt oddly unafraid. "Why risk coming back?" "To warn you." Two hawks settled into a crouch, a position that would allow him to move quickly if needed. Broken Hand and his warriors plan more attacks. 4 settlements marked for destruction. Broken Hand, war chief who led raid here, bitter man who lost family to army bullets at Medicine Lodge, seeks vengeance on all whites. Two hawks gestured toward the window. "Captain with yellow hair knows this." Captain Thornton mentioned renegade bands, Eleanor confirmed. A Chief Grey Wolf told him about planned attacks. Two hawks nodded. Grey Wolf is peace chief, respected among many bands. But young warriors follow Broken Hand now. Reservation brings hunger, disease. Peace chiefs lose influence when people starve. Eleanor considered this information, connecting it with Thornton's earlier comments about reservation conditions. Why? Oh, tell me this. Why not speak directly to Captain Thornton? A sound resembling laughter, though utterly without humor, escaped Two Hawks. "Comanche scout approaching army camp alone? Would be shot before speaking first word." "Then why risk coming at all?" Eleanor pressed. Two Hawks studied her for a long moment before answering. "During raid, I saw you. Woman with fire in eyes, not fear. Reminded me of stories my grandmother told of brave Comanche women who faced enemies without flinching." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Your people will die if they stay here. Settlement must be abandoned." The statement landed like a physical blow. Abandon Willow Creek, but the cavalry cannot stop what comes. 30 soldiers against 100 warriors. Mathematics even white schools must teach. Eleanor sank onto her cot, mind racing. The survivors had just begun rebuilding, finding hope in the military protection and the return of some captives. To suggest abandoning everything now seemed impossible. "The people here have nowhere else to go," she argued. "Their homes, their livelihoods are here. What remains of them?" "Better to lose buildings than lives," Two Hawks replied simply. "Settlements farther east offer safety. Fort Richardson itself would shelter refugees." A new thought occurred to Eleanor. If your people know soldiers are here, why attack at all? Surely even 100 warriors would suffer losses against military rifles and training. Two Hawks leaned forward slightly. Broken Hand does not seek easy victory. He wants vengeance, even at cost of his own life. His voice lowered further. "And he has new weapons. Repeating rifles taken from gun traders, more firepower than your soldiers expect." The implication sent a chill through Eleanor. Captain Thornton's men carried single-shot Springfield rifles, devastating when used in coordinated volleys, but potentially outmatched by repeating weapons in the hands of determined attackers. "I have to warn Captain Thornton," she said, rising from the cot. Two Hawks moved with startling speed, blocking her path to the door. "Captain would demand how you learned this. would question who told schoolteacher about Comanche weapons and plans. Eleanor hadn't considered this obvious problem. Her mysterious knowledge would immediately raise suspicions, possibly endangering her position in the community. Then what do you suggest? I can't simply remain silent while people prepare to die. 2. Hawks considered this dilemma. Tell Captain rumors from captive women. Say they overheard warriors speaking of new weapons and large war party. Captain will believe women traumatized, perhaps confused, but wise military leader takes even uncertain threats seriously. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, though it required deception Eleanor wasn't entirely comfortable with. Still, if it saved lives, why help us? She asked suddenly. Your people have suffered greatly at the hands of settlers and the army. Many would say Broken Hand's vengeance is justified. 2 Hawks moved to the window, checking the positions of the patrolling soldiers before responding. Vengeance creates only more vengeance, endless cycle of blood. My father died by army bullets. My mother from white man's disease. Should I kill every blue coat and settler, then your people kill more Comanche and wheel turns again. He shook his head. Some among both peoples must break this wheel, or all will be crushed beneath it. The philosophy surprised Eleanor with its wisdom and compassion. Nothing in her education or the frontier narratives had prepared her for a Comanche warrior who spoke with such insight about the futility of perpetual violence. You risk much to share this warning, she observed, as do you by listening instead of screaming for soldiers. 2 Hawks moved toward the window, preparing to leave. 3 days until full moon. That is when Broken Hand will attack. Before then, don't wait to convince your people to leave this place. Wait, Eleanor said impulsively. The remaining captives, do you know where they are? A boy and girl from our settlement, and 2 young men. 2 Hawks paused, half silhouetted in the window frame. With Broken Hand's band, deep in Comanche territory now. His expression softened slightly at Eleanor's visible distress. Children, sometimes adopted into tribe, treated well. Young men. He didn't finish the thought. Is there any way to get them back? Eleanor asked, though she suspected the answer. Grey Wolf negotiates. Offers horses from his own herd as ransom, but Broken Hand may refuse to maintain power through fear. 2 Hawks slipped halfway through the window before adding, I will send word if children can be saved. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Eleanor with terrible knowledge and an impossible choice. Morning brought new activity to Willow Creek. Captain Thornton had ordered construction of defensive positions, a rough stockade around the central buildings and firing platforms at strategic points. The survivors worked alongside soldiers, hope visibly renewed by military organization and purpose. Eleanor moved through the bustling settlement in a daze, 2 Hawks' warning weighing heavily on her mind. How could she convince these people to abandon their homes just as they began rebuilding? How could she convince a career military officer to retreat without revealing her source? Her opportunity came unexpectedly when Captain Thornton approached her as she distributed water to workers. Constructing the stockade. Miss Montgomery, he greeted, touching the brim of his hat. I was hoping to ask a favor. Mrs. Williams mentioned you've been counseling the women and children since the attack. I'm concerned about Miss Harrington. Emily Harrington was the unidentified captive, a young woman traveling through Willow Creek when the raid occurred. Unlike the other returned captives, she had no family present and had spoken barely a word since her rescue. Dr. Pierce believes she's suffering from severe shock, Thornton continued. He suggested a woman's gentle approach might help. Would you be willing to sit with her, perhaps even get her to eat something? Eleanor recognized the perfect opportunity to implement 2 Hawks' suggestion. Of course, Captain. I'm happy to help. Emily Harrington had been given a cot in the Reynolds home, in a small room that had once been Martha's sewing area. The young, Woman sat motionless by the window, staring at nothing, her dark hair hanging limply around a face devoid of expression. "Miss Harrington," Eleanor said softly, setting down a tray with broth and bread. "I've brought some food. My name is Eleanor Montgomery. I'm the schoolteacher here." No response came from the traumatized woman. Eleanor sat beside her, speaking in gentle tones about inconsequential matters, the weather, the progress on the stockade, the kindness of the Reynolds family. Gradually, she guided the conversation toward Emily's experiences. "The other women say you were very brave during your captivity," Eleanor ventured. "Mrs. Williams mentioned you understood some of what the Comanche were saying to each other." This produced the first reaction, a slight widening of Emily's eyes, a subtle tensing of her shoulders. "It's all right," Eleanor assured her. "You're safe now, but anything you overheard might help Captain Thornton protect the settlement." Emily's hands twisted in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged as a whisper. They talked. "About guns, new guns." Eleanor leaned closer. "What about them, Emily? What did you hear?" "Repeating rifles, many bullets without reloading." Emily's gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "The leader, they called him Broken Hand, said they would come at the full moon, said no soldiers would survive." "How many warriors did you see?" Eleanor pressed gently, providing the specific details that would make Emily's account credible to Thornton. "Many, more arriving every day." Emily's voice strengthened slightly. "They boasted about 100 rifles, said white settlements would burn until soldiers retreated east of the Trinity River." Eleanor reached for Emily's hand, feeling guilty for manipulating the traumatized woman, yet convinced of the necessity. "You've been very brave to tell me this. Would you be willing to share it with Captain Thornton? It could save many lives." Emily shrank back. "I can't. Don't make me face another man, please." "Of course not," Eleanor soothed. "With your permission, I'll tell him what you've shared. You won't need to speak with anyone else about this." Emily nodded weakly, then turned back to the window. Retreating once more into her protective silence, Eleanor found Captain Thornton supervising the placement of a defensive cannon at the northern edge of the settlement. She relayed Emily's information with careful precision, including specific details about weapon types and the timing of the planned attack. Thornton's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications. "Repeating rifles would shift the tactical balance considerably," he murmured, almost to himself, "and our ammunition supplies are limited. What will you do, Captain?" Eleanor asked, trying to mask her anxiety. Thornton surveyed the half-completed stockade with a critical eye. "Continue preparations, of course. I've requested reinforcements from Fort Richardson, though I doubt they'll arrive in time." He glanced at Eleanor. "I'd appreciate if you kept this information between us for now. No need to create panic among the civilians." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, though she wondered how evacuation could occur without the civilians being informed of the danger. As Thornton walked away, Eleanor felt the weight of her deception. She had successfully planted the warning, but the captain showed no sign of ordering an evacuation. If anything, his response suggested he intended to fortify and fight, exactly what Two Hawks had warned would lead to massacre. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days to convince an entire settlement to abandon their homes and possessions based on information she couldn't fully explain. 3 days to save lives without revealing that she had met twice with a Comanche scout, an act that might be considered treason in the charged atmosphere of the frontier. Eleanor returned to her damaged schoolhouse as evening approached, her mind churning with impossible choices. As darkness fell over Willow Creek, she lit a single candle and opened her Shakespeare collection to Henry V, finding cold comfort in the words, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Outside, soldiers continued strengthening barricades against an enemy whose strength they still underestimated. Tomorrow, Eleanor decided, she would have to find a more direct approach to convince Captain Thornton of the true danger approaching Willow Creek, even if it meant risking her own position and safety in the process. Dawn of the second day found Eleanor watching military preparations with growing anxiety. Captain Thornton had doubled the sentry posts and accelerated work on the stockade, but showed no indication of evacuating the settlement. If anything, the increased military activity had reassured the civilians, who worked with renewed vigor alongside the soldiers. Eleanor approached the command tent, where Thornton stood examining a rough map of the region spread across a field table. "Captain, might I have a word?" she asked, having rehearsed her approach carefully. Thornton glanced up, his expression distracted. "Miss Montgomery, what can I do for you?" "I've been thinking about Miss Harrington's information," Eleanor began. 100 warriors with repeating rifles. Those are concerning odds, even for trained soldiers. Thornton straightened, studying her face. "Military strategy isn't generally the domain of school teachers, Miss Montgomery." "No, but mathematics is," she countered. 30 soldiers against 100 warriors with superior firepower. Those calculations don't favor our position." A faint smile crossed Thornton's face. "You're remarkably direct for a lady." "Frontier living discourages excessive delicacy, Captain." Eleanor held his gaze. "Have you considered evacuation? Fort Richardson could shelter everyone until the danger passes." The smile vanished from Thornton's face. "Abandoning a strategic position based on unverified intelligence from a traumatized captive would be militarily unsound, Miss Montgomery. Besides, these people have already lost enough without being forced to flee their homes." "They'll lose in their lives if we remain," Eleanor pressed. "We?" Thornton raised an eyebrow. "I admire your courage, but this is a military matter now. I've requested reinforcements, and we're well positioned to defend the settlement." He gestured to the map. "The topography favors us, and Comanche typically avoids sustained engagements against fortified positions." "Typically," Eleanor echoed. "But you yourself said this situation is atypical. If Broken Hand seeks vengeance rather than tactical advantage." Thornton's expression sharpened. "How do you know that name?" Eleanor realized her mistake too late. Emily Harrington hadn't mentioned the war chief by name in their conversation. She struggled to maintain composure. Mrs. Williams must have mentioned it when discussing what the captives overheard. She improvised. Thornton studied her with increased intensity. "Broken Hand is not a name most captives would have heard, Miss Montgomery. It's his Comanche designation, not what whites call him." Eleanor felt herself sinking into dangerous territory. "Perhaps I misunderstood, or she mispronounced it." "Perhaps." Thornton's tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "You seem unusually concerned about Comanche tactics and motivations for someone who spent the raid hiding by the creek." The accusation stung, though Eleanor recognized the tactical nature of his probing. "I'm concerned about the safety of my neighbors and students, Captain. If you believe we're adequately protected, I'll trust your military judgment." She turned to leave, but Thornton's voice stopped her. "Miss Montgomery, if you have information relevant to this settlement's defense, regardless of how you obtained it, withholding it could endanger everyone here." The statement hung between them, both challenge and opportunity. Eleanor hesitated at the tent flap, weighing impossible options. If she revealed Two Hawks' warning directly, she risked being branded a collaborator. If she remained silent, she potentially condemned everyone to death. 2 days, Captain," she said finally, without turning back. "If reinforcements haven't arrived by tomorrow night, please consider moving the civilians to safety, regardless of military protocols." She left before he could respond, feeling his eyes on her back as she walked away. The conversation had accomplished little besides raising Thornton's suspicions about her. Evacuating Willow Creek would require a more dramatic approach. Eleanor spent the morning helping with defenses, her mind working through possibilities. By midday, she had formulated a desperate plan, one that required assistance she wasn't certain would be forthcoming. That evening, after helping distribute the community meal, Eleanor quietly gathered supplies from the schoolhouse: a small mirror, a lantern, matches, and her father's revolver. She waited until the midnight sentry change, noting the positions of soldiers as they rotated duties, then slipped from the settlement through a gap in the partially completed stockade. The night was clear, a waxing gibbous moon providing enough light to navigate by. Once her eyes adjusted, Eleanor moved carefully away from Willow Creek, using scattered trees for cover, until she reached the creek that gave the settlement its name. Following its course eastward, she eventually arrived at a rock formation she had visited with students during nature walks, a natural landmark well outside regular patrol routes. There, half concealed in the shadows, Eleanor waited, wondering if her plan was merely foolish or actively suicidal. She had no guarantee Two Hawks monitored the settlement, no certainty he would see her signal, and no assurance he would respond if he did. After ensuring she was alone, Eleanor lit the lantern and used the mirror to create a series of flashing light signals: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the universal distress pattern. She repeated the sequence several times, then extinguished the light and retreated deeper into the rocks to wait. An hour passed with no response. Eleanor began to lose hope, questioning her decision to venture alone into the darkness. The revolver provided little comfort against the vastness of the Texas night and its many dangers. A soft sound from behind made her whirl, weapon raised. Two Hawks materialized from the darkness, his expression reflecting mild amusement at her startled reaction. "Brave schoolteacher becomes night signaler," he observed quietly. "Dangerous game." Eleanor lowered the revolver, relief washing over her. "You came," was already watching. Signal unnecessary but clever. Two Hawks settled into a crouch beside her, scanning their surroundings with practiced efficiency. Why risk leaving settlement protection? "Captain Thornton won't evacuate based on my warning. He's fortifying instead, waiting for reinforcements that won't arrive in time." Eleanor explained her failed attempt to convince the captain. "We need something more dramatic to force evacuation." Two Hawks considered this. "Army captains follow orders, not school teachers' advice. What plan forms in your mind that requires night meeting?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "A false attack. Not to harm anyone, but to convince Captain Thornton the threat is immediate and overwhelming." Two Hawks' expression remained unreadable in the darkness. "Explain." "If a small group of Comanche warriors made a demonstration tomorrow night, shooting from beyond rifle range, creating the impression of a larger force, Thornton might reconsider his position," Eleanor explained, "especially if they displayed repeating rifles." "You ask me to risk warriors' lives to save settlement that sits on Comanche hunting grounds," Two Hawks observed. "Why would I agree?" "Because you've already risked your life twice to warn me," Eleanor replied. "You said yourself, vengeance only creates more vengeance. If Broken Hand succeeds, the army will retaliate against all Comanche, including peaceful bands." Two Hawks was silent for a long moment. "How many would die in false attack if soldiers shoot well?" "None, if done properly. Your men would remain beyond effective rifle range, appear briefly, fire into the air, then withdraw." Eleanor leaned forward earnestly. "Just enough to demonstrate the threat without engagement," Captain May pursue. "He won't leave the settlement undefended, not with women and children to protect," Eleanor argued. "And a brief skirmish would..." Convince him to send the civilians to safety while he awaits reinforcements. Two hawks seemed to weigh multiple factors silently before responding. Grey Wolf might agree. 6 warriors, quick demonstration only. He studied her face in the moonlight. But price exists. Price, Eleanor asked warily. Information, military strength, stockade weak points, soldier positions. Two hawks held up a hand as she began to protest. Not for attack on settlement, for protecting our hunting camps from army patrols. Knowledge keeps peace by preventing accidental encounters. Eleanor hesitated. What he requested bordered on treason during active hostilities. Yet she sensed his intent was genuine. I'll tell you what I know about the defenses, but not troop movements or passwords. And only if you swear no harm will come to the civilians. Fair exchange. Two hawks agreed. When soldiers and settlers leave, we guard empty town against broken hand. Keep buildings standing for return after danger passes. The offer surprised Eleanor. You would protect the settlement? Empty buildings worth less than lives. Broken. Hand seeks blood, not timber. They spent the next half-hour exchanging information, Eleanor describing the stockade construction and defensive arrangements, Two Hawks detailing his plan for the false attack. When they finished, a mutual understanding had formed between them that transcended their cultural differences. Tomorrow night, Two Hawks confirmed, after sunset, but before full darkness. Southwest approach draws attention away from eastern evacuation route. As they prepared to part ways, Eleanor impulsively reached for his arm. Why are you helping us? The truth this time. Two Hawks was silent for a moment. My mother was captive before becoming Comanche wife. Mexican woman taken as child, adopted into tribe. She taught that souls have no color. Creator judges actions, not birth nation. He looked toward the distant lights of Willow Creek. Many would call me half-breed, belonging nowhere. I choose to belong everywhere instead. The revelation added new complexity to her understanding of this man who moved between worlds. Before Eleanor could respond, he melted into the darkness, leaving her to make her way back to the settlement alone. Dawn brought new purpose to Eleanor's movements. If the plan succeeded, this would be the last day of Willow Creek's present occupation. She helped with preparations while carefully observing military dispositions, her conscience troubled by the dual nature of her actions, working alongside neighbors while facilitating an action they would view as betrayal. Mid-morning, Captain Thornton sought her out as she taught an impromptu lesson to the settlement's remaining children, gathered in the shade of an oak tree, since the schoolhouse remained unusable. A moment of your time, Miss Montgomery, he requested, his tone professional but eyes watchful. Eleanor dismissed the children with a reading assignment, then followed Thornton a short distance away. You were absent from your quarters for several hours last night, he stated without preamble. Eleanor's heart raced, though she maintained an outward calm. I had difficulty sleeping. The events of recent days have been troubling. The sentries reported no one walking within the settlement. I sat behind the remains of the church, she improvised. The night was clear, and I find stargazing calming. Thornton studied her face. Strange that no one saw you return. Perhaps their attention was directed outward, as it should be, Eleanor suggested. A long moment passed as Thornton seemed to weigh her explanation against his suspicions. The sentry's primary responsibility is external threat detection, he acknowledged finally. But these are dangerous times for solitary wanderings, Miss Montgomery. I'd ask you to remain in your quarters after dark. Of course, Captain. Eleanor agreed, recognizing the order beneath the request, though it seems unlikely we face immediate danger behind military protection. Something flickered in Thornton's expression, doubt or concern, before his professional mask returned. Precautions prevent tragedies, Miss Montgomery. Remember that. As he walked away, Eleanor wondered if he suspected more than he revealed. The evening's plan had become even more critical and more dangerous, with increased scrutiny on her movements. By sunset, Eleanor had quietly prepared a small pack with essential items, hidden beneath her cot in the schoolhouse. Whatever happened tonight would change everything for Willow Creek and for her place within the community. As darkness approached, she joined the other civilians for the evening meal, trying to appear normal while watching the southwestern horizon. Soon, if Two Hawks kept his word, a false attack would create genuine fear and potentially save everyone's lives if Captain Thornton made the right decision in response. Eleanor silently rehearsed what she would say when panic erupted, how she would encourage evacuation without revealing her role in orchestrating it. The deception weighed heavily, but the alternative seemed unthinkable. Broken Hand's full attack would leave no survivors to judge her actions. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky crimson as the first evening star appeared. Eleanor took a deep breath, waiting for the performance that would determine whether Willow Creek's people lived or died. The first shots rang out just as the last traces of sunset faded from the sky. Sharp cracks of rifle fire echoed from the southwestern ridge, followed by war cries that carried clearly through the evening air. The effect on Willow Creek was immediate and electric. Civilians dropped their supper plates and scattered for cover, while soldiers rushed to defensive positions. "Contact southwest," a sentry shouted. "Multiple riders." Captain Thornton emerged from his command tent, already buckling his gunbelt. "Sound assembly. All civilians to the stone buildings. Defensive positions now." Eleanor watched the coordinated military response with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Two Hawks had kept his word. The timing was perfect, creating maximum impact without causing injuries. Through the growing darkness, she could make out silhouettes of mounted warriors moving along the ridge, their forms illuminated briefly by muzzle flashes as they fired into the air above the settlement. "Miss Montgomery." Thornton spotted her, standing apart from the fleeing civilians. "Get to the Reynolds house immediately." She nodded and moved toward the designated shelter, but positioned herself near John Reynolds on the porch rather than entering the crowded interior. From this vantage point, she could observe both the military response and the effectiveness of Two Hawks' demonstration. The Comanche riders, Eleanor counted 6 as promised, maintained their position beyond effective rifle range, occasionally firing and then repositioning to create the impression of greater numbers. A soldier next to Captain Thornton peered through field glasses. "Sir, they've got Winchesters," he reported, confirming what Thornton must have already suspected. "I count at least 3 repeating rifles among them." "Showing off their hardware," Thornton muttered. "This isn't a standard raiding pattern." Eleanor held her breath, waiting to see if the captain would reach the conclusion she'd hoped for. The false attack had already accomplished one objective, demonstrating that the Comanche possessed repeating rifles and were willing to approach. Despite the military presence, a brave or foolhardy soldier fired toward the distant riders, the shot falling well short of its target. In response, the Comanche executed a synchronized maneuver, splitting into 3 groups that moved in different directions along the ridge. The tactical sophistication wasn't lost on Thornton, whose expression darkened as he observed through borrowed field glasses. "They're probing our defenses," he said to his lieutenant. "This is reconnaissance, not a serious attack." "For what purpose, sir?" the lieutenant asked. "To prepare for something larger." Thornton lowered the glasses. "Miss Harrington's information appears increasingly credible." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. The demonstration was working exactly as intended, lending credibility to the warnings without causing casualties. Now Thornton just needed to make the right decision about evacuation. The Comanche continued their display for another 10 minutes, creating the impression of testing the settlement's defenses from multiple angles. Occasionally, a warrior would Ride closer, fire a shot, then retreat rapidly, always staying beyond the effective range of the soldiers' weapons. Finally, as if responding to some unseen signal, the warriors regrouped and disappeared over the ridge. A tense silence fell over Willow Creek, broken only by Captain Thornton's crisp orders to maintain alert status and double the sentries. Eleanor waited for the next logical step, an evacuation order. But it didn't come. Instead, Thornton gathered his officers for a consultation, while the civilians remained huddled in the stone buildings, fearing the warriors might return. Unable to contain her impatience, Eleanor approached the military huddle. "Captain Thornton, surely this confirms the danger we face." Thornton glanced up, his expression revealing momentary surprise at her boldness before hardening into professional distance. "Miss Montgomery, this is a military discussion." "Those warriors were testing your defenses," she pressed. "If they return with the numbers Miss Harrington described." "I'm well aware of the tactical implications," Thornton interrupted, "but evacuation creates its own dangers. Moving civilians across open territory with Comanche in the area could be disastrous. Remaining here could be worse," Eleanor countered. Something in Thornton's expression shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but revealing a complexity beyond military calculation. "We're considering all options, Miss Montgomery. Please return to the shelter and help keep the civilians calm." Recognizing dismissal, Eleanor reluctantly withdrew, her mind racing through alternatives. The demonstration had failed to trigger immediate evacuation, though it had clearly affected Thornton's assessment. What now? If the settlement remained until Broken Hand's full attack, Two Hawks' effort and her risky gamble would have been for nothing. Inside the Reynolds house, fear had transformed into angry speculation. Frederick Williams voiced what many were thinking. "They're testing us before the slaughter. We should leave while we still can." "And go where?" John Reynolds countered. "Out there in the dark with savages roaming around? The army's here to protect us, 30 soldiers against however many were out there." Williams shook his head. "I'm not risking my family again, not after getting Abigail back by miracle." The debate continued, with the community dividing between those who trusted military protection and those who favored immediate flight. Eleanor listened silently, noting the growing consensus toward evacuation, regardless of Thornton's orders. When she slipped outside to check on developments, she found an unexpected scene. A wagon was being loaded with medical supplies and ammunition under Lieutenant Collins' supervision, while Thornton stood examining a map with his sergeant. "Miss Montgomery." Thornton acknowledged her approach without looking up. "I was about to send for you." "You've decided to evacuate," she observed, relief evident in her voice. "A tactical repositioning," Thornton corrected. "The civilians will move to Fort Richardson under military escort. Half my men will remain here to maintain a presence and monitor enemy movements. Not a complete evacuation, but enough to save the civilians." The result Eleanor had hoped for, even if Thornton's reasoning differed from what she had anticipated. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Immediately. We'll use the eastern route, moving under darkness for the first 5 miles before the moon rises fully." Thornton studied her face. "You seem unsurprised by this decision." "It's the logical choice," Eleanor replied carefully. "I'm relieved you reached it." Thornton continued to regard her with that penetrating gaze that suggested he was assembling pieces of a puzzle. "Indeed, please inform the civilians to prepare for immediate departure. Essential items only. Food, water, medicine, 1 change of clothing. Everything else stays." Within the hour, a solemn procession had formed on the eastern edge of Willow Creek. 3 wagons carried the injured, the elderly, and essential supplies, while everyone else walked alongside, carrying what few possessions they could manage. 15 soldiers formed a protective escort under Lieutenant Collins' command, while Thornton and the remaining men prepared to defend the settlement's shell. As Eleanor joined the evacuation column, carrying only her small pack and her father's medical bag, Thornton approached her one last time. "Miss Montgomery, a word." She stepped aside with him, anxiety fluttering in her stomach. Had he somehow discovered her role in orchestrating the demonstration? "I've been considering your unusual interest in our defensive preparations," Thornton said quietly, "and your unexplained absence last night. Under normal circumstances, I might pursue a more thorough investigation." Eleanor tensed, preparing a denial that died unspoken as Thornton continued. "But these aren't normal circumstances." He glanced toward the departing civilians. "Whatever your involvement, your concern for these people appears genuine. I trust that remains your priority." The statement hung between them, not quite an accusation, not fully absolution. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "My only concern is preventing unnecessary deaths, Captain." "On all sides of this conflict," Thornton nodded slowly, "a commendable if somewhat idealistic position." He straightened, resuming his formal military bearing. "Safe journey to the fort, Miss Montgomery. Lieutenant Collins has orders to move quickly, and avoid engagement if possible. And you, Captain? 15 men against 100? We'll maintain a visible presence until reinforcements arrive, then conduct an orderly withdrawal." A tight smile crossed his features. Contrary to romantic notions, military officers don't seek glorious last stands. "We'll be right behind you once the additional troops reach us." Eleanor wasn't certain she believed him, but arguing would serve no purpose. She rejoined the column as Lieutenant Collins gave the order to move out. The procession began its slow journey eastward, leaving behind homes, possessions, and 15 soldiers who might well be sacrificing themselves to buy the civilians time. They had traveled perhaps a mile when Eleanor heard hoofbeats approaching from behind. Her heart raced, fearing pursuit, but it was a single rider, one of Thornton's men, riding hard to catch the column. "Lieutenant Collins," the soldier called. "Captain's orders. Change course immediately. Head southeast toward Harper's Crossing." Collins reined in his horse. "What's happened, Private?" "Signal fires, sir," the soldier reported breathlessly. "All along the northern ridge. The scouts estimate 50 to 60 warriors assembling. Captain says they're positioning to cut the direct route to Fort Richardson." A murmur of fear passed through the civilian column. Collins quickly consulted his map. "Harper's Crossing adds 8 miles to our journey." "Better than running into a Comanche war party, sir," the private responded. "Captain says they're definitely not the same group that approached earlier. These are coming from the reservation direction." Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle over her. Broken Hand's main force was arriving a day early, perhaps alerted by scouts who had observed the military preparations. The false attack had succeeded in triggering evacuation, but their escape route was already compromised. "Redirect southeast," Collins ordered. "Quicken pace, everyone. We need to reach the crossing by midnight." As the column changed direction, Eleanor found herself beside Frederick Williams and his family. The farmer's face was grim as he urged his exhausted children forward. "Should have left days ago," he muttered. "Should have known the army couldn't protect us." Eleanor had no response that wouldn't reveal her foreknowledge. Instead, she helped Mrs. Williams with their youngest child, her mind turning to Two Hawks and his warriors. Had they observed the evacuation? Would they maintain their promise to protect the empty settlement? Or would they be drawn into conflict with Broken Hand's larger force? The night deepened around them as they pushed southeast, every shadow potentially concealing danger, every distant sound causing the column to freeze momentarily. Lieutenant Collins maintained remarkable discipline, keeping the civilians moving steadily while sending scouts ahead to secure their path. By midnight, they had reached Harper's Crossing, a shallow ford across a normally placid stream that spring. Rains had transformed into a more challenging obstacle. The wagons crossed with difficulty, wheels slipping on submerged rocks while soldiers steadied them against the current. On the far bank, Collins ordered a brief rest. Eleanor sank gratefully onto a fallen log, her feet blistered from the unaccustomed march and her arms aching from carrying children too exhausted to walk. Around her, the civilians of Willow Creek huddled in small groups, their faces reflecting the same question that dominated her thoughts. Would they survive until morning? As if in answer, a distant glow appeared on the northwestern horizon. A fierce orange light that could only be fire. Willow Creek was burning. They've reached the settlement, Collins observed grimly. God help Thornton and his men. Eleanor stared at the distant flames, knowing what no one else in the column realized. The fire might well have been set by two hawks rather than Broken Hand, a strategic destruction to prevent Broken Hand from claiming the settlement. Empty. Buildings weren't worth lives, he had told her. Now those empty buildings served as a funeral pyre for the community they had once sustained. The lieutenant allowed only 20 minutes rest before ordering the column forward again. Fort Richardson lay nearly 15 miles ahead, a journey that would take them through the remainder of the night and into the following day, assuming they met no resistance along the way. As Eleanor rose to continue the march, she cast one final glance toward the burning settlement. Willow Creek had been her home for 4 years, the place where she had rebuilt her life after losing her family. Now it existed only in memory, its physical manifestation reduced to ash by the very conflicts she had hoped to transcend through education and understanding. The column moved forward into darkness, leaving the fire behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps eventually safety. Eleanor adjusted her pack and followed, each step carrying her further from her past and toward a future she could no longer predict. Dawn painted the eastern sky with pale watercolors as the exhausted column from Willow Creek stumbled onward. They had traveled through the night, stopping only for brief rests when the children could go no further. Lieutenant Collins maintained disciplined rotation of scouts ahead and behind the group, but so far they had encountered no sign of pursuit. Eleanor's body ached with each step, her throat parched despite careful rationing of water. Around her, families supported elderly relatives and carried sleeping children, their faces etched with grim determination born of simple survival instinct. "How much further?" Frederick Williams asked, as he shifted his sleeping daughter to his other shoulder. "About 8 miles, Lieutenant Collins answered, consulting his map. "We should reach Fort Richardson by early afternoon." The news brought little visible relief to the weary travelers. 8 miles might as well have been 80 in their current condition. "Lieutenant!" A scout galloped back from his forward position. "Riders approaching from the east, sir." Collins immediately signaled the column to take cover in a stand of scrub oak beside the trail. "Numbers and identification?" "At least 20 mounted men, sir." "Not Comanche. They're riding in military formation." Relief washed through the civilians as Collins smiled. "The reinforcements Captain Thornton requested. They must have departed before receiving word of our evacuation." Within minutes, the riders appeared. A cavalry detachment led by a major whose weathered face suggested years of frontier service. He reined in sharply at the sight of Collins. "Lieutenant, what in blazes are you doing out here with civilians?" Collins saluted. "Evacuating Willow Creek settlement, sir. Captain Thornton's orders. We've received intelligence of an imminent large-scale attack." The major, Westfield, according to the name Collins used in his explanation, listened with growing concern as the lieutenant detailed the events of the previous day, including the reconnaissance by mounted warriors and the signal fires spotted. "To the north, Thornton remained behind with 15 men?" Westfield asked incredulously. "Yes, sir, to maintain a presence until reinforcements arrived." Westfield turned to his second-in-command. "Lieutenant Hayes, escort these civilians to the fort. The rest of you, with me. We're riding for Willow Creek immediately." Eleanor stepped forward impulsively, Major, wait. The settlement was burning when we last saw it. The Comanche likely overwhelmed Captain Thornton's position hours ago. Westfield assessed her with sharp eyes. And you are? Eleanor Montgomery, sir. The schoolteacher from Willow Creek. Well, Miss Montgomery, I appreciate your concern, but military protocols are clear. We don't abandon our men without confirmation of their status. Eleanor wanted to argue further, to prevent more bloodshed when Thornton and his men were almost, certainly already dead, but recognized the futility. Military honor demanded Westfield attempt rescue, regardless of the likely outcome. The column split, with the majority of cavalry riding westward toward the smoking remains of Willow Creek, while Lieutenant Hayes and 5 soldiers continued escorting the civilians toward Fort Richardson. The renewed journey felt both easier with the assurance of military protection and harder as exhaustion deepened with each passing hour. By midday, Fort Richardson's walls appeared on the horizon, a sprawling wooden stockade surrounding military buildings, officers' quarters, and auxiliary structures. Never had plain lumber and whitewash looked so beautiful to Eleanor's weary eyes. As they approached the fort's eastern gate, riders emerged to meet them, a patrol returning from duty. Among them, incredibly, was Captain Thornton himself, his uniform scorched and dirty, but his bearing as military precise as ever. Lieutenant Collins stared in disbelief. "Captain, we thought the settlement was burning." "We executed a fighting withdrawal after you departed," Thornton explained, dismounting to walk beside the column. "The Comanche breached the stockade from multiple directions around midnight. We held as long as possible, then escaped through the emergency route we'd prepared." "All your men?" Collins asked. A shadow crossed Thornton's face. "We lost Davies and Forrester. The others made it out with varying injuries." Eleanor studied him with a mixture of relief and suspicion. His appearance at the fort meant he had abandoned the settlement before their column even reached Harper's Crossing, contrary to what he had told her about maintaining a presence until reinforcements arrived. "We saw the fire," she said quietly as he walked near her position. Thornton's gaze met hers briefly. "Yes, they burned everything, though interestingly they waited until we had withdrawn." Something in his tone suggested this detail held significance, beyond the obvious, almost as if they wanted to ensure we escaped before destroying the empty buildings. Eleanor maintained a neutral expression despite her racing thoughts. Had Two Hawks' people indeed protected the soldiers during their withdrawal? Had they deliberately waited until Thornton's men were safe before burning the settlement to deny it to Broken Hand? Fort Richardson's gates opened to receive the refugees from Willow Creek. Military efficiency quickly asserted itself as the civilians were directed to temporary quarters. Medical attention was provided to the injured, and food and water distributed to all. Eleanor found herself assigned to a small room in the officers' wives' quarters, a courtesy extended due to her position as schoolteacher. The room's simple comfort, a real bed, clean water for washing, walls that provided genuine security, seemed almost unreal after the ordeal of the past week. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and delayed reaction to all she had experienced. A knock at her door roused her from near sleep. Captain Thornton stood in the hallway, his uniform changed, and his face freshly washed, though fatigue lined his features. "Miss Montgomery, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Captain. Please come in." Eleanor stood, smoothing her wrinkled dress automatically. Thornton entered but remained standing, maintaining a formal distance. "I wanted to check on your well-being. The evacuation was difficult for everyone." "I'm fine, thank you. More concerned about the families who lost everything." She studied his face. "You escaped the settlement before we even reached Harper's Crossing. That seems unexpectedly rapid." A slight smile touched Thornton's lips. "You continue to monitor military movements." "With remarkable attention, Miss Montgomery." "Simple observation and mathematics, Captain. The timing suggests you abandoned the settlement almost immediately after we departed." Thornton moved to the small window, looking out at the fort's busy courtyard before responding. "We received additional intelligence after your column left. Information that indicated the attack would come sooner and in greater force than anticipated." "What intelligence?" Eleanor asked, perhaps too quickly. Thornton turned to face her directly. "A Comanche scout approached our perimeter under a white flag. He spoke excellent English and warned us specifically to withdraw immediately." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Did he identify himself?" "He called himself Two Hawks." Thornton watched, her face carefully. "The name seems to mean something to you." The moment had arrived that Eleanor had feared since first meeting Two Hawks, direct confrontation with the truth of her involvement. She could continue denying, maintaining the fiction that she knew nothing of Comanche scouts or unauthorized communications, or she could acknowledge what Thornton clearly already suspected. "He's the one who warned me about the attack," she admitted quietly. "He approached me at the schoolhouse after you established the garrison. Said he was a scout for the peace chiefs, tracking the movements of a renegade war chief named Broken Hand." Rather than the anger or accusation she expected, Thornton nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. Your knowledge of Comanche leadership and tactical plans was too specific for someone who supposedly spent the raid hiding by the creek." "Are you going to arrest me for communicating with the enemy during hostilities?" Eleanor asked directly. Thornton's expression softened slightly. "That would be rather hypocritical, considering I just withdrew my entire command based on the same Comanche's warning." He sat in the room's single chair. "Two Hawks told me you arranged the demonstration attack to convince me to evacuate the civilians. Said you were, and I quote, 'brave like Comanche woman, stubborn like army mule.'" A surprised laugh escaped Eleanor despite the tension. "That sounds like him. He also said something else interesting." Thornton leaned forward slightly. "That Broken Hand's attack was ultimately aimed at provoking military retaliation against all Comanche bands, including peaceful ones. That certain factions want renewed war because the reservation system is failing. The peace policy doesn't work. When people are starving," Eleanor said softly. "Two Hawks explained that peace chiefs lose influence when they can't feed their people." Thornton nodded grimly. "The treaty obligations haven't been fulfilled. Rations are half what was promised, and corrupt agents skim even from that." He glanced toward the window again. "Did you know Two Hawks is the son of Grey Wolf, the peace chief who returned our captives?" Eleanor shook her head. "He mentioned his mother was Mexican, captured as a child. Nothing about his father. Grey Wolf is one of the most influential peace advocates among the southern Comanche bands. His son, serving as a scout and intermediary, represents significant political investment in preventing all-out war." Thornton's expression became thoughtful, "which makes our current situation particularly delicate." "What do you mean?" "Major Westfield is preparing a punitive expedition against Broken Hand's band. Standard military protocol after an attack of this magnitude." Thornton's tone suggested his own reservations about this approach. Unfortunately, distinguishing between hostile and friendly bands during such operations is rarely a priority. Eleanor understood the implications immediately. "You're saying they might attack Grey Wolf's people in retaliation for Broken Hand's actions?" "It's happened before." Thornton stood, resuming his formal bearing. "I've submitted my report emphasizing the distinction between the bands and Two Hawks' critical assistance. Whether it influences operational planning remains to be seen." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You took an extraordinary risk, Miss Montgomery. contacting a Comanche scout, arranging the demonstration attack, actions that could be construed as treasonous under certain interpretations. "I couldn't let everyone die when there was a chance to prevent it," Eleanor replied simply. Thornton studied her for a long moment. "No, I don't imagine you could." He opened the door. "Rest while you can. The civilians will be transferred to Jacksboro settlement once arrangements are finalized, probably within 3 days." "And what about Willow Creek?" Eleanor asked. "Military assessment teams will determine whether rebuilding is viable after the current hostilities are resolved." His tone suggested this was unlikely in the near term. "The frontier is contracting, Miss Montgomery. The railroads pushing settlement patterns westward in more defensible configurations. Isolated communities like Willow Creek may be relics of a transitional era." After Thornton departed, Eleanor lay on the bed, her mind processing the implications of their conversation. Thornton knew of her involvement with Two Hawks, yet hadn't arrested her. The military was planning retaliation that might harm innocent Comanche, and she herself was soon to be relocated to Jacksboro, a larger settlement where her role as schoolteacher would continue among strangers. Through the window, she could hear the sounds of fort life, soldiers drilling, horses being tended, wagons delivering supplies. The structured military environment offered physical safety but felt emotionally sterile after the raw intensity of recent days. Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her, but her dreams were filled with burning buildings and a Comanche scout who moved between worlds as she now found herself doing, trusted by neither side completely, yet striving to preserve what was best in both. 3 months passed at Fort Richardson, the summer heat turning the Texas prairie golden brown as June faded into September. Eleanor had settled into a routine, teaching the children of the fort's personnel, along with those displaced from Willow Creek. The military's promised transfer to Jacksboro settlement had been repeatedly delayed due to continuing Comanche activity in the region. Major Westfield's punitive expedition had returned after 6 weeks, with little to show for its efforts. Broken Hand's band had proven elusive, disappearing into the vast landscapes they knew intimately. The expedition had encountered only a few small groups of Comanche, most of whom claimed allegiance to peace chiefs and displayed the white flags that supposedly guaranteed their safety. Captain Thornton, who had remained at the fort due to his knowledge of local tribal politics, grew increasingly frustrated with the military's blunt approach. Eleanor often observed him arguing with senior officers, his voice carrying across the parade ground as he advocated for more selective targeting of hostile bands rather than generalized pressure on all Comanche. On a sweltering September morning, Eleanor sat beneath the shade of an oak tree near the fort's eastern wall, using the weekend respite from teaching to mend one of her few remaining dresses. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. "Miss Montgomery," Captain Thornton greeted her, his campaign hat shading his face from the relentless sun. "I was hoping to find you." Eleanor set aside her sewing. "Captain, has there been news about the Jacksboro transfer?" "Not exactly." Thornton glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I've received communication from Grey Wolf's band. They're requesting a meeting to discuss terms for returning the remaining captives from Willow Creek." Eleanor's heart leaped. "The Miller twins and Joshua Williams, they're alive?" "Apparently so." Thornton lowered his voice further. "Grey Wolf has been negotiating with Broken Hand's band for their release. He's finally succeeded, but insists on specific conditions for the exchange." "What conditions?" "He wants a small party, no more than 5 people, no uniformed soldiers except myself, and—" Thornton hesitated. "He specifically requested your presence." Eleanor stared at him in surprise. "Me? Why would Grey Wolf ask for a schoolteacher he's never met?" "The message came through Two Hawks," Thornton explained. He indicated that the captive children would respond better to a woman's presence, especially one with experience caring for children. Understanding dawned. 2 hawks had engineered her inclusion in the exchange party, though she couldn't fathom his exact reasoning. Major Westfield approved this unusual arrangement. Reluctantly, the families of the captives were quite persuasive in their appeals. Thornton's expression suggested there was more to the story. "We depart tomorrow at dawn. Small wagon for the children's return journey, 5 riders, including yourself. Minimal provisions, as we'll meet them only a half-day's ride from here." "That seems surprisingly close for a Comanche band to approach a military fort," Eleanor observed. "Gray, Wolf is taking significant political risk within the tribal structure," Thornton confirmed. "This meeting occurs without Broken Hand's knowledge or approval. If word reaches the war faction that Grey Wolf is independently negotiating with the military..." He left the potential consequences unspoken, but Eleanor understood. Grey Wolf risked his standing and possibly his life to return the captives and maintain his peace initiatives. "I'll be ready at dawn," she promised. The next morning found a small party departing Fort Richardson's eastern gate. Captain Thornton led the way, followed by Eleanor on a gentle mare provided from the fort's stables. Behind them came Frederick Williams, determined to personally retrieve his son, and the parents of the Miller twins, a solemn couple in their 50s who had remained nearly silent during preparations. A single wagon, driven by a civilian scout, completed their party. They followed the river eastward, moving at a steady pace through terrain that alternated between open grassland and scattered stands of oak. Thornton maintained vigilant attention to their surroundings, though his manner suggested confidence rather than anxiety about potential ambush. "The meeting place is a natural clearing about 5 miles ahead," he informed them as they stopped to water the horses. "Grey Wolf selected it for visibility in all directions. He's as concerned about hostiles interrupting this exchange as we are." By mid-morning, they reached the designated location, a grassy meadow surrounded by widely spaced trees that would indeed make surprise approach difficult. Thornton directed them to wait in the center while he surveyed the perimeter. "No sign of them yet," he reported upon returning. "But they'll have scouts watching us already. We should prepare the wagon for the children's comfort." Eleanor helped arrange blankets and water containers in the wagon bed, while the families nervously scanned the horizon for any approaching riders. The September heat intensified as noon approached, creating shimmering waves across the distant prairie. "There!" Frederick Williams said suddenly, pointing northeast. A dust cloud appeared, where he indicated, gradually resolving into mounted figures approaching at a measured pace. Eleanor counted 7 riders and felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the distinctive headdress of the lead figure, a peace chief's regalia, similar to what she had glimpsed during Grey Wolf's earlier diplomatic mission to Willow Creek. "Remember," Thornton cautioned everyone, "follow my lead and make no sudden movements. This is a diplomatic exchange, not a military operation." The Comanche party halted about 50 yards away. 4 warriors formed a protective semicircle, while their leader and 2 others continued forward. As they drew closer, Eleanor immediately recognized 2 hawks riding slightly behind an older man who could only be Grey Wolf. Between them rode 3 small figures, the captive children, dressed in Comanche clothing, but unmistakably the missing young people from Willow Creek. The parents gasped and would have rushed forward if Thornton hadn't restrained them with a gesture. "Let me establish the protocols first," he insisted. Grey Wolf reined his horse to a stop at a conversational distance. His weathered face carried the dignity of authority and the wisdom of experience. Though he must have been in his 60s, he sat his mount with the straight-backed posture of a much younger man. "Captain Thornton," he greeted in accented but clear English. "You honor agreement by bringing small party." "Chief Grey Wolf," Thornton responded with equal formality. We appreciate your efforts to secure these children's return. Grey Wolf nodded, then turned slightly to acknowledge Eleanor. Schoolwoman who helped my son, Two Hawks speaks of your courage. Eleanor inclined her head respectfully. I'm honored to meet you, Chief Grey Wolf. Thank you for bringing the children. The chief studied her briefly before addressing the group again. Children have been treated as guests of tribe, given Comanche names, taught our ways. But their spirits call for their own people. He gestured toward the children. No payment required. This exchange builds understanding between peoples. The contrast between this dignified peace initiative and the military's failed punitive expedition struck Eleanor forcefully. Grey Wolf had accomplished through negotiation what Major Westfield's armed force couldn't achieve in 6 weeks of aggressive pursuit. Two Hawks guided the children forward. The Miller twins, Mary and Joseph, both 16, appeared physically healthy, though their expressions remained wary. 5-year-old Joshua Williams seemed to have adapted most completely to Comanche life, wearing his native clothing with apparent comfort and watching the proceedings with curious eyes rather than fear. The reunion unfolded with emotional intensity. Frederick Williams knelt with open arms as Joshua hesitantly approached, recognition dawning slowly on the boy's face. The Miller parents embraced their teenagers with tears streaming down weathered cheeks, their earlier stoicism crumbling in the face of joyful relief. Eleanor observed that the children's return to their families wasn't as straightforward as the adults might have hoped. The young people showed signs of confused loyalty, responding to their parents while glancing back at their Comanche hosts with expressions that suggested genuine attachment had formed during their captivity. As the families became reacquainted, Two Hawks approached Eleanor and Thornton, dismounting to speak with them directly. Children learned Comanche ways quickly, he explained, became part of family groups, will need time to remember old life. Their parents understand they've been through an ordeal, Eleanor assured him. We'll help them readjust gradually. Two Hawks nodded, then addressed Thornton. Grey Wolf risks much to arrange this exchange. Broken Hand's influence grows. More young warriors join him each moon. The army continues to plan operations against hostile bands, Thornton replied carefully. I've tried to emphasize the distinction between peace factions and war factions, but military leadership prefers simpler categories. Simple thinking creates blood feud without end, Two Hawks observed. Grey Wolf offers different path. Eleanor noticed Grey Wolf watching them from horseback, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. The power dynamic was fascinating. The aging chief working through his son to maintain diplomatic channels with the encroaching American authority while preserving his dignity as a Comanche leader. After a brief consultation with Grey Wolf, Two Hawks turned back to them. Chief proposes continuing peace talks, regular meetings between representatives to prevent misunderstandings that lead to violence. I can convey that proposal to Fort Command, Thornton offered, though I can't guarantee their reception. Two Hawks then spoke directly to Eleanor. Schoolwoman understands both worlds, could help with such talks. He hesitated, then added, more quietly, if she wished to continue building bridges rather than walls. The implication was clear, an invitation to participate in ongoing peace efforts, to employ her unusual position between cultures toward preventing further bloodshed. Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion from the Comanche lookouts interrupted their conversation. A warrior galloped toward Grey Wolf, speaking rapidly in Comanche. The chief's expression hardened as he barked orders to his men. Two Hawks immediately remounted his horse. Army patrol approaching from southwest, he explained tersely. Not part of agreement. Grey Wolf must depart immediately. I gave no orders. For additional forces, Thornton protested, scanning the horizon where dust now indicated approaching riders. Westfield sends patrols without consulting peace-minded captains, Two Hawks replied with grim certainty. Grey Wolf cannot be seen, negotiating if war faction learns of it. The Comanche party prepared for immediate departure, their practiced efficiency evident in every movement. Before riding away, two hawks turned to Eleanor one final time. In 10 days, at Creek Crossing near burned settlement, if you wish to discuss Grey Wolf's proposal further. He glanced at Thornton. Bring trusted people only. Then they were gone, riding northeast at a pace that would quickly outdistance any pursuing cavalry. The dust had barely settled when 8 mounted soldiers appeared from the southwest, their lieutenant raising a hand in greeting upon recognizing Thornton. "Captain, didn't expect to find you out here, sir." "Routine escort for civilians, Lieutenant," Thornton replied smoothly. "The children from Willow Creek have been recovered through diplomatic channels." The lieutenant seemed disappointed at missing the Comanche. "Major Westfield will want details of any tribal contacts, sir." "He'll have my full report," Thornton assured him, though Eleanor noted the careful phrasing that didn't necessarily promise complete disclosure. They returned to Fort Richardson by late afternoon, the successful recovery of the captives creating a small celebration among the displaced Willow Creek community. Eleanor watched the families reunite fully, noticing how the children gradually relaxed into their former identities while retaining subtle mannerisms acquired during their time with the Comanche. That evening, Captain Thornton found her sitting alone on a bench outside the officers' quarters. "You've been quiet since our return," he observed, joining her without invitation. "Thinking about bridges and walls," Eleanor replied. "Two hawks metaphor has stayed with me." Thornton nodded. "Grey Wolf's proposal will likely be rejected officially. Military protocol doesn't allow for the kind of informal diplomatic channel he's suggesting. And unofficially," a slight smile crossed Thornton's face, "unofficially, frontier officers have considerable operational discretion. Patrols can be routed to avoid unnecessary contact with peaceful bands. Intelligence reports can emphasize distinctions between hostile and friendly tribal factions, and the creek crossing near Willow Creek. In 10 days, Thornton studied the darkening sky before answering. "I've been ordered to survey the burned settlement next week to assess rebuilding potential. A small detachment 2-day mission. If a civilian schoolteacher wished to recover personal items from the ruins, such a request would seem reasonable." The implication was clear. He would provide cover for her to meet with two hawks, continuing the unofficial communication channel, while maintaining plausible deniability for both. "Why take such risks, Captain?" Eleanor asked. "Your career could suffer if these unofficial initiatives were discovered." Thornton was silent for a long moment. "I've served on this frontier for 12 years, Miss Montgomery. I've participated in campaigns that achieved nothing but increased hatred and determined resistance. I've watched peace initiatives collapse because neither side truly understood the other." He turned to face her directly. "If there's even a small chance to break that cycle, the risk seems worthwhile." 10 days later, Eleanor stood among the charred remains of Willow Creek Schoolhouse. Captain Thornton's survey detachment had made camp a discreet distance away, giving her privacy to allegedly gather personal belongings from the ruins. Little remained to salvage. Fire had consumed most structures completely. Yet Eleanor found comfort in reconnecting with the place that had been her home for 4 years. She collected a few heat-warped metal items and half-melted glass beads from her former quarters, placing them in a small pouch as tangible memories. The sound of an approaching horse drew her attention. 2 hawks appeared, riding slowly through the desolate street that had once formed Willow Creek's center. He dismounted near the schoolhouse foundation, his expression revealing genuine regret at the destruction. "Many good things lost here," he observed. "Knowledge in books, children's learning place, people's homes. Buildings can be rebuilt," Eleanor replied. "The community survives, even if scattered now. Like Comanche after reservation systems separated bands," 2 hawks noted. People find way to continue, even when forced to new places. They walk together through the ruins, an unlikely pair united by shared concern for the frontier's future. Two hawks explained Grey Wolf's vision: regular communication between peace factions, shared intelligence about renegade activities on both sides, gradual building of trust through small cooperative actions. Captain Thornton understands value of this approach, Two Hawks said, but needs trustworthy interpreter between worlds, someone who speaks to both sides with respect. You mean me, Eleanor realized. But I'm a schoolteacher, not a diplomat. Teachers bridge worlds through knowledge, Two Hawks replied simply. Show each side others' humanity. This is diplomacy at its root. As they reached the burned church, Two Hawks removed a small object from his pouch, a carved wooden horse, its design displaying remarkable craftsmanship. Made by woman in Grey Wolf's band, he explained, offering it to Eleanor. For school, woman who values children of all peoples. Eleanor accepted the gift, recognizing its significance beyond the simple object, a token of trust, an acknowledgement of shared values across cultural boundaries. If I agree to help, she asked, what exactly would that involve? Meetings at safe locations, carrying messages when military men cannot, teaching Comanche children English words while learning Comanche ways yourself. Two Hawks gestured toward the burned settlement. Perhaps someday, new school here with children from both peoples. The vision seemed simultaneously impossible and essential, a path toward peaceful coexistence that official policy had failed to create. It would be dangerous, Eleanor noted. Both sides would view such efforts with suspicion. Most valuable paths carry greatest risk, Two Hawks acknowledged, but also greatest possibility. As they stood amid the ashes of her former life, Eleanor made her decision. The frontier was changing irrevocably. The old patterns of conflict and retaliation had created only suffering on both sides. Perhaps something new could emerge from these ruins, not just rebuilt structures, but rebuilt understanding. I'll help, she said simply, for the children who deserve a future without constant fear, for the possibility that we might all learn to see beyond our differences. Two Hawks extended his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement, which Eleanor accepted with a firm clasp. The symbolic power of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. A frontier schoolteacher and a Comanche scout standing amid destruction while planting seeds of potential reconciliation. One day, Two Hawks said as they parted, people will tell story of schoolwoman who found herself between worlds and built bridge instead of wall. Eleanor watched him ride away, the carved wooden horse clutched in her hand. Behind her, the sun cast long shadows across the charred timbers of Willow Creek. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and hope in equal measure. She had come west seeking purpose after losing everything. Now she had found it in the most unexpected circumstances, not in books or lessons, but in the courageous work of building understanding where fear had reigned. Captain Thornton's voice called from the edge of the ruins, indicating it was time to return to their camp. Eleanor tucked the wooden horse into her pocket and turned away from the ashes of her past, moving toward a future she would help create, one careful conversation at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.